There's a moment that happens in America every single day, and almost nobody notices it. A person checks their bank account and realizes that one unexpected expense, just one, would wipe them out completely. Not ruin their plans, not set them back a little. Erase everything. Rent, food, stability, dignity, gone. And here's the part that doesn't make sense. This person might have a full-time job. They might even be doing everything right. So, how does someone go from stable to homeless in a matter of weeks? That's not supposed to happen, but it does, all the time. We like to tell ourselves a simple story about money in America. If you work hard, stay disciplined, and make smart choices, you'll be okay. It's a comforting belief. It gives us control, but it's also incomplete. Because if that story were fully true, then millions of Americans wouldn't be living on the edge of collapse. And yet, they are. Studies consistently show that a large portion of Americans are one paycheck away from financial disaster. Not because they're reckless, not because they don't care, but because the system they're operating in has quietly shifted beneath their feet. Picture this. You wake up. You go to work. You pay your bills. You repeat. Nothing dramatic. Nothing chaotic. Just a normal life. Until one day, your car breaks down, or your rent increases, or your hours get cut, or you get sick. And suddenly, the math stops working. Not gradually, instantly. That's the part that's hard to grasp. It's not a slow fall. It's a trapdoor. And this is where things get uncomfortable, because we've been trained to interpret financial struggle as a personal failure. If someone is struggling, we assume they made bad choices, spent too much, saved too little, planned poorly. But what if the real story is more structural than personal? What if millions of people aren't failing the system, but surviving inside a system that was never designed to protect them? Think about how fragile modern financial life actually is. Most people don't have months of savings sitting around, not because they don't want to, but because their income barely keeps up with their expenses. Wages rise slowly, if at all. But costs move fast. Housing, healthcare, food, transportation, each one quietly stretching the distance between getting by and falling apart. And here's the contradiction that should make you pause. We're living in one of the wealthiest countries in human history, and yet, stability, for the average person, feels more uncertain than ever. That's not an accident. That's a signal. At first glance, being one paycheck away sounds like a budgeting problem. But it isn't. It's a margin problem, a buffer problem, a system that leaves people with no room for error. And when there's no room for error, even small problems become life-altering events. But here's the part nobody talks about. This isn't just about money. It's about psychological pressure. Living on the edge changes how you think, how you decide, how you plan. It narrows your world, forces you into short-term thinking. Because when survival is uncertain, long-term strategy becomes a luxury. And maybe you've felt this. That quiet anxiety when your account balance gets low, that mental calculation every time you swipe your card, that constant background stress you can't quite turn off. That's not weakness. That's adaptation to a system that demands precision but offers no forgiveness. And if this idea resonates with you, if you've ever felt like stability is just out of reach, it might be worth staying for this conversation. Not because there's an easy answer, but because understanding the problem changes how you see everything else. Because what looks like individual struggle might actually be a collective condition, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Now here's where the story takes a turn most people don't expect. Because the question isn't just why people are one paycheck away, it's how that became normal. There was a time, not perfect, not ideal, but different. A single income could support a household. Rent didn't swallow half your paycheck. Healthcare wasn't a looming financial threat. And stability, while never guaranteed, wasn't this fragile. So what changed? At first, the shift was subtle. Wages slowed down, but productivity didn't. People kept working harder, producing more, contributing more value, but their share of that value, it stopped growing the same way. And this is where things get uncomfortable, because the economy didn't stop expanding. It just started expanding unevenly. Wealth didn't disappear. It concentrated. And when that happens, something else quietly disappears too. Margin. Think about margin like oxygen. You don't notice it when you have enough. But the second it's gone, everything becomes harder. Every decision carries weight. Every mistake becomes dangerous. For millions of Americans, that margin has been shrinking for decades, not in dramatic, headline-grabbing ways, but in slow, almost invisible increments. A little more rent here, a slightly higher bill there, a cost that used to be manageable, becoming permanent. And here's the trap. Because it happens gradually, people adapt. They normalize it. They adjust their expectations downward. They tell themselves, this is just how life is. But it wasn't always. And it doesn't have to be. Now add another layer. Debt. Not reckless, irresponsible debt. Necessary debt. Student loans to access opportunity. Credit cards to bridge the gap between paychecks. Medical bills that arrive without warning. Car payments just to stay employable. And this is where the illusion breaks. Because debt doesn't just fill the gap. It redefines reality. It creates a version of stability that only exists as long as nothing goes wrong. You're not stable. You're balanced. Carefully. Precariously. On top of obligations that never stop demanding. And here's the part nobody talks about. Debt doesn't just take money. It takes time. Future choices. Future freedom. Every payment is a claim on your tomorrow. And when enough of those claims stack up, you're no longer building a future. You're maintaining a present. So when people say, why don't they just save more? They're missing the reality entirely. Because saving requires surplus. And surplus requires margin. And margin is exactly what's been disappearing. Now zoom out. This isn't happening to a small group of people making bad decisions. This is happening to teachers, nurses, retail workers, office employees, people with degrees, people without them, people doing everything they were told would lead to stability. And still, one disruption away from losing it. At first, this looks like a financial issue. But it isn't just that. It's structural. It's systemic. It's built into the way modern life is organized. Because when the cost of existing rises faster than the reward for participating, people don't fall behind because they failed. They fall behind because the system moved the finish line. And this is where things get even more unsettling. Because the system doesn't just create instability. It hides it. From the outside, everything can look fine. A job, an apartment, a car, maybe even a vacation once in a while. But underneath, no cushion, no backup plan, no safety net strong enough to catch a real fall. It's a performance of stability, not the real thing. And if you've ever looked around and thought, how are people affording this? There's a good chance. Some of them aren't. Not really. They're just closer to the edge than they appear. And here's the deeper question. What happens to a society where most people are living like that? Where stability is temporary and security is conditional? Because that doesn't just affect bank accounts. It changes behavior. It reshapes priorities. It quietly rewires how people think about their lives. And once that shift happens, the consequences go far beyond money. Here's something most people never say out loud. Living one paycheck away from collapse doesn't just affect your finances. It changes your brain. Not metaphorically, literally. When stability is uncertain, your mind shifts into survival mode. Your focus narrows. Your attention locks onto immediate threats. Bills, deadlines, due dates, risks. And everything else, long-term goals, planning, even creativity gets pushed to the side. This isn't laziness. It isn't a lack of discipline. It's cognitive load. And this is where things get uncomfortable. Because we tend to judge people in survival mode, using the standards of people who aren't in it. We say things like, why didn't they save more? Why didn't they plan ahead? Why don't they just make better decisions? But decision-making changes under pressure. When your margin disappears, your ability to think long-term disappears with it. Imagine trying to plan 5 years ahead, while worrying about how to make it through the next 2 weeks. That's not a mindset problem. That's a bandwidth problem. And here's the part nobody talks about. Scarcity doesn't just limit your options. It taxes your attention. Every unpaid bill becomes a mental notification you can't clear. Every expense becomes a calculation. Every decision carries weight. Should you fix the car now, or risk it breaking down later? Pay off debt, or keep cash on hand. Take a day off to recover, or lose income you can't afford to lose. These aren't simple choices. They're trade-offs between risks. And when you're forced to make those trade-offs constantly, it drains you mentally, emotionally, physically, and over time, that drain compounds. This is why people stuck in financial precarity often feel exhausted, even if they're not doing anything visibly different. Because the effort isn't just physical, it's psychological. Now here's where the narrative breaks down again. From the outside, this can look like poor decision-making, impulse spending, short-term thinking, inconsistency. But those behaviors don't come out of nowhere. They're responses. Adaptation. When the future feels uncertain, the present becomes more valuable. And this is where things get even more unsettling. Because the system that creates this pressure also punishes the behaviors that pressure produces. Later phase, interest rates, penalties, credit score damage. It's a feedback loop. You fall behind, and the cost of falling behind makes it even harder to catch up. And suddenly, being one paycheck away isn't just a condition. It's a cycle. But here's the deeper layer most conversations miss. This isn't just happening to individuals. It's happening at scale, which means the effects aren't isolated. They ripple outward. Think about what happens when millions of people are forced into survival mode. They delay healthcare. They postpone education. They avoid risks. They stay in jobs they don't want because they can't afford uncertainty. Innovation slows. Mobility shrinks. Stress rises. And slowly, quietly, a society that once promised upward movement starts to feel like it's holding people in place, not through force, but through pressure. And here's the contradiction that should stick with you. The harder people try to stay afloat, the less room they have to actually move forward. Effort increases, but progress stalls. At first, this looks like individual stagnation, but it isn't. It's systemic friction. And once you recognize that, the question changes. It's no longer, why are people struggling? It becomes, what kind of system produces this many people who can't afford to fail? Because in a healthy system, failure is survivable. In this one, failure is often catastrophic. And when the consequences are that high, even small risks become unbearable, which leads to a life that looks stable on the surface, but feels fragile underneath. And that fragility is what keeps millions of people exactly where they are. Now here's where the conversation gets even harder to ignore. Because when millions of people are living this close to the edge, it doesn't just shape individual lives, it reshapes the entire culture. Think about it. If you know one mistake could cost you everything, you don't take risks. Not the kind that change your life. Not the kind that challenge the system. You stay where it's safe. Even if safe isn't actually safe, just familiar. And this is where things get uncomfortable. Because a society built on constant financial pressure doesn't just produce workers. It produces compliance. Not because people are weak, but because they can't afford not to be. If speaking up risks your job, and losing your job risks your home, then silence starts to look like the rational choice. That's not a personality trait. That's economic pressure shaping behavior. And here's the part nobody talks about. Financial insecurity doesn't just limit what you can buy. It limits what you're willing to say, what you're willing to challenge, what you're willing to change. Because change requires risk, and risk requires margin. Now zoom out again. What happens when most people don't have that margin? Fewer people start businesses. Fewer people switch careers. Fewer people walk away from bad situations. Not because they don't want to, but because the cost of being wrong is too high. And slowly, the system stabilizes itself, not by supporting people, but by restricting their options. That's a very different kind of stability. Now layer in something else. Identity. In America, we tie identity closely to work. What do you do? Isn't just a question. It's a definition. So when financial stability depends on keeping that role, your job becomes more than income. It becomes survival, status, security. And this is where things get even more complex. Because losing a job isn't just losing money. It's losing structure, losing identity, losing your place in the system. So people hold on, even when the job is draining, even when the pay isn't enough, even when the path forward is unclear. Because letting go doesn't feel like freedom. It feels like falling. And here's the contradiction. We celebrate freedom, opportunity, mobility, but many people are operating under conditions where those things are technically available and practically unreachable. It's like being told the door is open, while standing on a floor that might collapse if you move. So you stay still. And over time, that stillness gets mistaken for choice. But it isn't. It's constraint. And this is where the narrative gets dangerous. Because when we misinterpret constraint as choice, we start blaming people for adapting to pressure. We say, they should try harder, they should take risks, they should aim higher, without acknowledging what those risks actually cost. Because risk isn't equal. For someone with savings, support, and safety nets, failure is a setback. For someone living paycheck to paycheck, failure can be irreversible. And that difference changes everything. It determines who gets to experiment, who gets to fail safely, who gets to build something new, and who has to play it safe forever. But here's the deeper question. What kind of future are we building when stability is this fragile and risk is this expensive? Because over time, this doesn't just affect individuals. It shapes the trajectory of an entire generation. One that's working harder than ever, but feeling less secure, earning more on paper, but keeping less in reality, connected to more opportunity, but unable to access it without risk they can't afford. And at some point, a realization starts to emerge, quietly, gradually, but powerfully, that the problem isn't just about income, it's about structure. And once that realization sets in, the conversation changes again. So now we arrive at the question that sits underneath everything. If so many people are doing everything they were told would lead to stability, why does stability still feel so fragile? Because at some point, it stops being a coincidence and starts being a pattern. And this is where the story becomes less about individual lives and more about the design of the system itself. A system where income is often fixed, but expenses are not. Where essential needs, housing, healthcare, education operate more like markets than guarantees. And here's the part nobody talks about. When the cost of living is treated like a variable, but your income isn't, the pressure has somewhere to go. It goes to you. You absorb the volatility. You carry the uncertainty. You adjust your life around forces you don't control. And over time, that becomes normalized. People stop asking, why is this happening? And start asking, how do I survive it? But those are two very different questions. One accepts the system as fixed. The other challenges it. And this is where things get uncomfortable again. Because questioning the system doesn't always lead to easy answers. There's no single policy, no quick fix, no simple solution that suddenly restores margin for millions of people. But recognizing the pattern, that changes something. Because once you understand that being one paycheck away isn't just about personal choices, you stop internalizing it as personal failure. And that matters more than it seems. Because the stories we tell ourselves shape how we respond to reality. If you believe you're failing, you try to fix yourself. If you realize the system is misaligned, you start asking different questions about work, about value, about what stability should actually mean. And here's the shift that often goes unnoticed. When enough people start asking those questions, the narrative begins to change. Slowly, quietly, but inevitably, because systems don't just persist through structure, they persist through belief. And when belief starts to crack, so does everything built on top of it. Now, that doesn't mean change happens overnight. It doesn't, but it does mean something important. The experience so many people thought was isolated is actually shared. And shared experiences have a way of turning into collective awareness. And collective awareness is where change begins. So the next time you hear that phrase, one paycheck away from homelessness, don't just hear it as a statistic. Hear it as a signal that something deeper isn't working the way we've been told it should. A signal that stability, as it currently exists, is more fragile than we want to admit. And maybe most importantly, a signal that the people living on that edge aren't the exception, they're the warning. And if this perspective shifted something for you even slightly, then stay close to conversations like this. Not for easy answers, but for clearer questions. Because sometimes, understanding the system is the first step toward no longer being quietly controlled by it.